The setting: America and the small town of Greenbrook. Let me take you on a little trip across the United States, to a corner of Oregon, where the Pacific Northwest quietly reveals its very best self. Greenbrook is one of those places that doesn't just rest on the map, it seeps into the bones and memories of anyone who's called it home, even for a short spell. The town nestles between rolling foothills and dark ridges, with pine forests fanning out from the edge of the famous Cedar Hill National Park. Nearby lakes glint like blue glass between arms of forest and clusters of wooden cabins, reminders of a time before internet, before fast food chains ever made it this far north. Greenbrook isn't big, barely more than 2,000 souls. Its main street is all red brick, vintage storefronts and lamplights that flicker on as dusk swallows up the day. Some folks run diners that have been in the same family since the 50s. Others keep cozy gift shops or hardware stores whose shelves are dusted with the oddities and memories of decades past. Old-timers gather in the town square on Saturday mornings to sell produce, honey, or vintage knickknacks from their barns. Kids bike along the river path winding through elms, and on clear nights the air is so fresh, you can almost taste the clean snap of lightning from a far-off storm. People here believe in neighborliness, helping clear snow from a driveway, bringing over casseroles in times of trouble, or simply sharing a word on the porch at sunrise. You'll find Greenbrook's heartbeat strongest in acts like these, and in the easy way folks walk into the post office or general store, calling each other by first names and asking after the health of old friends. Under that surface, though, every community, however peaceful, has its secrets and rifts. Greenbrook's is the kind of quiet that you only notice once it's suddenly broken. The town has its own proud patchwork of history too. Decades ago, waves of Scandinavian and German immigrants chased lumber dreams across these forests. Their culture lingers, maybe not as brightly as before, but you'll spot it in the Lutheran Church's summer potluck, in the recipe for cedar-smoked fish secreted away by a local chef, or the faded murals painted on the town's longest-standing buildings. There's a gentle rhythm to everyday life. Most mornings begin with coffee at Millie's Diner, laughter and newspaper rustling, as the scent of cinnamon buns drifts through the door. In autumn, the high school football team's games light up chilly Friday nights. Local legends about haunted mines, lost treasures in the woods, or uncanny happenings at Cedar Hill are passed around campfires. Despite this coziness, Greenbrook is not immune to the problems that challenge small-town America. Jobs ebb and flow with the state of the logging industry, young people often head off for cities as soon as they can, and the town board meets in anxious sessions about school funding or a controversial new real estate project just outside of town, but for all that, people stay. They stay for the sense of belonging, for the feeling that Greenbrook remembers your story even when you forget it yourself. So when tragedy struck, when something truly unspeakable crept into the town's ordinary rhythms, it did more than shock Greenbrook. It changed it. Because here, beneath the gentle arc of the cedars and the slow-moving waters, nothing dark could rest easy for long without being noticed. That's why, to this day, when the wind stirs the leaves outside the old church or the lake's mist drifts up at sunrise, folks still remember. Greenbrook became more than itself on that spring day in 2013. It became the sort of place the rest of America suddenly read about in headlines and never forgot. The spring rain and the strange anonymous letter. March in Oregon is a peculiar month. Winter's last chill lingers, teasing the town with bursts of icy drizzle, and then letting the first hints of green push up from the sleepy ground. In Greenbrook, rain doesn't pour, at least not in that dramatic Midwestern way, but rather seeps, soft and persistent, turning the mornings to mist and the afternoons to a wet gray hush that seems to swallow sound. That Friday, the 15th of March 2013, the town woke to the kind of relentless drizzle that makes even the evergreens look forlorn. It was one of those days where you can't tell if it's morning or night except for the smell of coffee drifting out of Millie's Diner and the muted headlights slicing through the half-light as folks made their slow way to work. At the Greenbrook Police Department, the only real sound was the tap of rain against the scarred front windows and the metallic rattle of the old heater. Officers shuffled paperwork and braced themselves for a day of wildlife calls, minor accidents, and perhaps, if the clouds held any surprises, a downed power line or two. Nobody, not even Linda Adams, the watchful and quietly respected police chief, expected the day to break its sleepy routine. That changed abruptly at 10:07 a.m. when an officer picked up a call patched in from Portland Police. The voice on the other end sounded unsure, skimming the border between skepticism and urgency. "We've got something strange, we need a favor." Can you check all public restrooms in your jurisdiction? We received a letter. It's likely nothing, but it cites Greenbrook specifically. The letter, which had arrived unannounced in Portland's mailroom just after sunrise, had been scrawled on bargain store stationery in a hand so tortured it seemed almost childish. Every letter had been traced and retraced, sometimes twice, as if the sender was struggling to hide their natural script. There was no signature, just a single troubling message. There is a body in a bathroom near the White Church. Please take care of the deceased. I have no money for burial. Thank you. In the small world of Greenbrook, this was as outlandish as a UFO sighting, and its peculiarity demanded action. Chief Adams's team gathered in the cramped station, raincoats squeaking as they huddled over the first printout of the letter. The language was simple, pleading, and the specificity of the location, proximity to Greenbrook's old white-spired Methodist church, put the officers on alert. Despite the logical part of their minds wanting to dismiss it as a twisted prank, the sense of gravity in the note couldn't be ignored. It was about a potential loss of life, something unthinkable for their peaceful Main Street. That urgency trumped all doubts. Adams quickly sketched a plan. Divide the squad, assign each pair to a cluster of public restrooms across the town's 3 main parks, and near the historic downtown. They would stay in constant radio contact, each officer quietly hoping it would be for nothing. As the day moved on, the rain neither lifted nor changed, it just thickened, clinging cold. Exploration in the dark and chilling discoveries. The sun had all but disappeared behind a shroud of low-hanging clouds, and the rain, now colder, almost biting, tapped insistently on the narrow windows of Greenbrook's aging public buildings. After hours of fruitless searching, a weary determination hung in the air around Chief Linda Adams, as she made her way slowly around the back of the old white church, a stately wooden structure that the town quietly revered, with its peeling white paint and grand yet fading stained glass. The world here was muffled, the squelch of her boots on the soaked, mossy ground, the soft static of her radio fizzing with reports, but mostly, the drumbeat thud of her own anxious heart. It was Adams's sense of duty, sharpened by decades of small-town experience, that made her pause at the battered public restroom just outside the church grounds. The light above the door flickered uncertainly in the rain, casting warped shadows over the concrete path. For a moment she almost convinced herself this anonymous tip was merely some cruel hoax or a bully's attempt to stir up trouble. But the ragged caution in the letter, the specificity of the White Church, and now, the faint chemical tang that mingled oddly with the rain, pulled her into the chill tiled darkness beyond the threshold. Inside the air was dense and thick, sharply at odds with the wet chill outside. The overhead bulb hummed, casting a sickly orange haze and making every surface seem sticky with neglect. At first nothing looked out of place, a cracked mirror, graffiti-scratched stalls, a faint trace of bleach in the air, but Adams's eyes were trained for the subtle, the wrong, the just out of frame. As she stepped closer to the last stall she noticed a large plastic bag awkwardly balanced atop the water tank. Her pulse quickened. Careful not to jostle anything, Adams moved in, calling quietly for backup, even as she knew the echo would travel poorly through thick concrete. Her gloved hands trembled, less from cold, and more from the raw gravity of what this could mean. The plastic itself was the cheap, thin kind handed out at grocery stores, and it looked unremarkable, if not for how carefully it had been tied. Almost reverently. She felt a wave of dread, an instinct older than logic, beyond simple police procedure. Waiting for her officers to arrive, Adams examined the bag without opening it, noting the multiple knots and faint smudge marks along the outside. Around the room, the air seemed to contract, the storm outside suddenly a world away. When the other officers entered, flashlights strobing across pale tiles, she directed them to document everything as precisely as possible. They snapped photos, noted the state of the restroom, and with collective breath held, began the methodical process of unwrapping the find. The first knot gave way, then another, each layer revealing more. A secondary grocery bag, then an old sweater, a faded raincoat, a pair of shorts. The stench of decomposition, sharp and unmistakable, forced several officers to turn away. By the time they finally peeled back the last layer, a pair of pale, worn women's underwear, they were met with something no one in Greenbrook could have ever prepared for: the severed head of an adult woman, hair tangled and skin ghost-pale beneath a gruesome crust of salt. A hush fell over the cramped space, broken only by one rookie's retching. Every cop in that restroom, regardless of years on the job, felt something snap in the familiar spirit of their town. In that instant, Greenbrook shed its quiet innocence. Chief Adams, fighting an overwhelming wave of grief and anger, steadied herself, eyes blazing, jaw set. They had their grim evidence now. The real nightmare was only beginning. Decoding the crime scene with forensic medicine. The forensics team arrived while the police officers were still reeling from the horror of their discovery. Chief Linda Adams stood aside, jaw tight, as two crime scene technicians in crisp blue coveralls and face masks began their methodical dance around the cramped public restroom. Rain still drummed against the cracked windows while harsh white light from portable lamps made every grimy tile look like a glaring spotlight on evidence. First, the technicians documented the scene in painstaking detail. Every angle of the plastic bags, each knot, the arrangement of the discarded outerwear, even the lingering stains on the tank lid, all were photographed and cataloged, nothing left to chance. Locals who had gathered outside behind the police tape murmured among themselves, frightened by rumors of what was found. Inside, the atmosphere was businesslike but tense. Forensics collected samples from the layers used to wrap the head, DNA from stray hairs caught on the inside of the raincoat, fabric fibers embedded in the plastic, trace evidence like salt crystals, and a peculiar pale residue that seemed to have seeped from the head itself. Everything was swabbed, tweezed, and sealed in sterile vials marked for analysis. Chief Adams watched as a senior pathologist knelt by the macabre find, carefully inspecting the head through latex gloves. Salt had crusted over the skin, accelerating dehydration and staving off decomposition, a method more often seen in ancient preservation than modern crime. It suggested that the perpetrator was either desperate to buy time, or possessed at least some knowledge of how to manipulate the body after death. There was a secondary shock. Tucked within the layers of clothing and stained with salt was a small slip of paper, an afterthought maybe, or a signature. The expert in handwriting summoned from the larger county seat examined the note beneath a forensic lamp, remarking on the way every letter was pressed and retraced, a futile effort to disguise the author's identity. As samples were hustled out to the department's modest lab, Adams considered what the evidence suggested. Whoever had committed this crime wasn't just hiding a body, but making a deliberate, almost ceremonial effort to mummify and conceal their victim. Forensics estimated that, given salt's dehydrating effect and the relatively cool environment of the restroom, the head could have been placed there days earlier, long enough for the trail to run cold, but not so long for everything to rot. Outside the restroom, a forensic anthropologist joined the team and began noting distinguishing physical features, careful not to disturb the meager evidence. Dental records would later confirm identity, but for now, they listed scars, dental implants, and even the hue and length of hair preserved, despite the ordeal. Photographs of the raincoat, the battered sweater, and any manufacturer tags were passed on for tracing through missing person reports. The chain of custody was meticulously maintained, every pair of gloved hands signed off with each transfer, a small-town department suddenly held to city standards by the severity of the case. Before midnight, the forensic van rumbled away, leaving behind a thoroughly scoured crime scene and a community that would never look at that public restroom the same way again. Tracing clues from names. At first, piecing together the identity of the victim felt a bit like searching for a single page torn from 1,000 different books. The name Jane Miller alone, a detail gleaned from early forensic leads and recovered snippets of evidence, offered little comfort. It was one of those names so common that it almost echoed, populating official records and digital databases across the state of Oregon and beyond. Reports of missing persons named Jane Miller cropped up in half a dozen small cities, casting doubt and, briefly, a sense of overwhelming anonymity onto the case. Greenbrook's police department, unequipped for anything near the complexity of a homicide, suddenly found themselves working alongside county investigators and specialists from Portland. Together they followed the thread of the name, sorting through lists, cross-referencing facial features and ages, even checking social media for clues. There was a haunting tension in the air as caseworkers combed through outdated yearbooks and police blotters, fixating on any small lead, past addresses, childhood friends, distinctive medical records, that could narrow down the field. The process was painstaking and at times deeply frustrating, especially with Greenbrook's limited resources and growing public anxiety. It wasn't just official efforts that came into play. Local reporters, drawn by rumors and speculation, started calling nearby towns and scouring obituaries for any sign of a matching Jane Miller. News of the investigation, handled delicately at first, soon trickled into social networks and online forums, prompting a handful of strangers to come forward with possible connections. Some tips proved valuable: a recently filed missing persons report from Portland, a dental record flagged by an attentive county coroner, an old photograph of a woman with a telltale birthmark on her cheek, found deep in a school archive. As the weeks unfolded, a picture began to emerge: a woman in her early 30s, last seen in Portland months earlier, with ties to Greenbrook through old family and the thin, fraying web of hometown friendships. Cross-referencing the physical features preserved from the crime scene with the medical histories available to them, the team traced connections, trying to bring to rest not just the victim but also the relentless doubts tugging at everyone involved. DNA tests and dental charting slowly brought certainty. Their Jane Miller wasn't just a data point, but a real person with stories, memories, and connections that ran deeper than anyone in Greenbrook could have guessed. For Chief Adams and her growing team, solving the riddle of the name was a bittersweet victory. It meant closure for the case's first, most haunting question: who was she? But also opened up new, more complex trails of personal tragedy and family heartbreak waiting to be unraveled. The dark past of Jane Miller. Jane Miller's past was laced with equal parts small-town charm and shadowed complexity, a study in contradictions, much like Greenbrook itself. In her teenage years, she'd been the kind of girl teachers remembered and classmates quietly envied: fiercely artistic, surprisingly witty, and beautiful in a way that caught sunlight on the school's football bleachers. Her paintings, often vivid depictions of dense, misty forests and piercing blue lakes, won her regional art awards. But there was always a wildness to Jane, a restlessness she felt deep in her bones, like Greenbrook was a jacket a size too small, destined never to quite fit. The Miller family sat at the nexus of Greenbrook society and scandal. Jane was the eldest of 5 siblings, a pseudo-matriarch when her parents worked double shifts or when her father's temper ran hot. Early memories carried bruises of both joy and trauma, helping her mother bake cinnamon bread while Jazz hummed through the kitchen, but also tiptoeing around her father's anger and the muffled arguments that crept down the hallway at night. The scars of her upbringing were both literal and figurative. Jane's adolescence took a sharp turn when her father abruptly left the family shortly after her 17th birthday. The departure hollowed out the Millers, leaving Jane with too heavy a burden to shoulder alone. She drifted further from her mother, who sank into her own depression, and by the time Jane graduated she was already experimenting with substances, usually behind the bleachers or at out-of-the-way house parties where older boys passed around cigarettes and cheap vodka. Her closest brother, David, alternated between protective and envious, their relationship a tangled thicket of codependency and unspoken resentment. By her early 20s, Jane's reputation in Greenbrook had shifted yet again. Gossip trailed her after each failed attempt at holding down a job or returning to school. She dated men who seemed drawn to her vulnerability and the hints of wildness that turned quickly to volatility. Some relationships ended quietly, others flared into police reports and tearful goodbyes, fueling rumors that swirled like mist around Greenbrook's taverns and laundromats. Her run-ins with the law were minor: trespassing, petty theft, the occasional night in a holding cell, but each incident carved deeper grooves in her already precarious sense of self. Seeking escape, Jane left Greenbrook more than once: Portland, then Seattle, then back to Greenbrook again, never staying long enough in any city to plant real roots, but never able to outrun the weight of her own choices. Substance use became dependency, and from there, it morphed into something darker. Some locals whispered that she'd been involved in sex work to support her habit when times were especially dire, but others insisted she was simply misunderstood, a casualty of a town that offered precious few ways out. Still, her artistic gifts never fully deserted her. Neighbors sometimes found murals painted in alleyways or discarded sketchbooks tucked behind the old mill, each drawing exuding a desperate kind of hope or loneliness. Those closest to Jane, her brother David most of all, walked the razor-thin line between loyalty and exhaustion, sometimes letting her crash on their couch, sometimes locking her out. By the time she reached her 30s, Jane had become both a familiar face and a tragic warning in Greenbrook, an artist's soul, battered by circumstance, carrying secrets heavier than even her closest friends could guess. A broken family and the helplessness of an American mother. Mary Miller had always thought of herself as stronger than most. There was a time when she could quiet a squabbling room full of kids with one gentle word, or stretch a week's worth of groceries to fill every hungry belly that gathered around her rickety kitchen table. For years she'd believed that, no matter what hardship or heartache swept through the threshold of their modest Oregon home, Her sheer willpower was enough to hold her family together. The reality had proven as relentless as the passage of time. Jane's disappearance, and now her death, pressed on Mary like a storm that never moved off the horizon. The Miller household, which once echoed with the shrieks, clattering feet, and secretive giggles of 5 children, had slipped into silence. For 3 months, Mary lived suspended between hope and dread. The nights were the worst. She would lie awake, replaying every moment she'd failed to protect Jane, the red flags she'd missed, the times she'd let her exhaustion short-circuit patience, the mornings she worked a double shift and left the kids to their own brittle devices. When the call came from the Greenbrook police asking her to come in, Mary felt herself disassociate, moving through the motions as if submerged under cold water. The dignified procession through the police station, the paperwork, the polite but unvoiced apologies, the low hum of officialdom, blurred in her mind. There had never been any true doubt about the results. When they asked her to identify Jane's belongings, she needed only an instant. The world contracted around the familiar pattern of a sweater she'd once mended, a chipped charm bracelet, the lingering trace of her daughter's favorite cheap perfume. Mary's signature on the confirmation line felt like a final, irreversible act, a contract with grief itself. Mary grappled with a pain that had no name. Neighbors brought casseroles, left sympathy cards, patted her hand with kindly eyes that never quite met hers. Greenbrook was awash in rumor and shrouded comfort. The town's collective heartbreak could not penetrate the fortress of her private anguish. She mourned Jane not only as the lost eldest daughter, but as the uncertain axis around which the whole Miller family once spun. Her remaining children struggled behind closed doors, each carrying guilt and confusion as their inheritances. Family dinners petered out into silence, the television serving as a flickering wall between those left behind. There were moments, fleeting unbidden, when Mary felt flashes of raw anger, even shame. Had she done right by Jane? Had she been too strict, or not strict enough? In the American fable of motherhood, the idea persisted that love, if strong enough, could shield a child from every darkness. Mary now knew it was never that simple. The American dream, she realized, was built as much from heartbreak as hope. In her quietest moments she caught herself talking to Jane's memory, bargaining with it, pleading for some sign of forgiveness. A fractured childhood and the lingering shadows. Jane's childhood was marked from the start by fractures, small, almost invisible at first, but each one deepening as the years edged forward. Even in her earliest memories, before the violence of her father's departure or the weariness that settled over her mother, there was always a tension in the air, the sense that love in their small Oregon home was a resource that could run out. Jane's first glimpses of genuine happiness were often stolen moments, childhood games with her brother David in the backyard, the crisp joy of the first day of school, or her mother's soft humming in the evening, but these were always fleeting, fragile, easily broken by raised voices or the heavy, muffled thump of footsteps down the hall after midnight. She was an unusually observant child, tuning herself to the undercurrents of mood in every room she entered. That meant she felt the family's struggles more acutely, the financial uncertainty after her father left, the nights when her mother would forget to make dinner out of exhaustion, the siblings who needed her to be stronger than any little girl should have to be. With so much pressure, Jane learned early how to disappear inside herself, her sketchbooks filled up with swirling, shadowed images and faceless figures. Her room became a sanctuary, but also a prison. She grew increasingly anxious and withdrawn. The darkness that edged her adolescence wasn't just a byproduct of external chaos, there was an inherited sadness, a kind of generational depression, that no adult around her was equipped to name, let alone heal. Jane developed habits of self-soothing that turned quietly into forms of self-sabotage, spending entire nights awake staring out her window to a world she felt exiled from, and later, sneaking sips of whatever alcohol she could find left over from old parties her parents once hosted. Jane's sense of isolation was magnified at school. She always had the feeling she was watching other children from a distance. Their friendships seemed easy, their laughter untouched by the coldness of the secrets she carried. Teachers would sometimes note the bruises on her arms or the hollow look in her eyes, but in Greenbrook, like in many small towns, there was a tendency to mind one's own business. No one pushed hard enough to pull her out of her spiral, and so the pain festered behind silent lips and polite smiles until it became something she wore every day. By the time Jane reached her teenage years, her broken childhood had shaped every part of her inner landscape. She trusted little, loved in fits and starts, and looked for family in unlikely places. The unresolved trauma was a shadow she could never quite shake, and its weight would go on to steer the course of her friendships, break her romances before they had a chance to grow, and push her back into the arms of those who hurt her most. Every ray of hope was measured against the darkness she carried, a darkness that, for all her efforts, was now as much a part of her as her name. Clues from underwear and family conflicts. The investigation took a pivotal, unsettling turn when the forensic lab returned its analysis of the items collected from the crime scene. Specifically, the women's underwear used as the final wrapping for Jane Miller's severed head. The details were as somber as they were crucial. Embedded in the fabric, among traces of salt and bodily fluids, was biological evidence that pointed to the recent presence of a second, unidentified individual, an adult male. This was no mere cross-contamination. The DNA profile retrieved did not match any of Jane's publicly known associates, nor did it correspond to her string of ex-boyfriends or acquaintances, each of whom was methodically ruled out through voluntary sampling and detailed scrutiny of their whereabouts during the period when Jane went missing. The confirmation of an unknown man's involvement sent shockwaves not only through the Greenbrook Police Department but also into the tight latticework of Jane's family. Suspicions that had begun as whispered doubts in the aftermath of her disappearance now simmered into allegations, some direct, others delivered in sidelong glances at family gatherings or in urgent midnight phone calls between relatives. For the detectives, the mounting pressure to identify the unknown contributor was sharpened by the increasing tension within the Miller house. The fact that Jane's death was so personal, her body treated with a peculiar, almost ritualistic care before disposal, made it clear that her killer had shared some degree of proximity or twisted intimacy with her. As the investigation ground on, attention began to focus closer to home, especially on those with complicated, emotionally charged relationships with Jane. Family interviews became fraught affairs, statements were parsed, timelines cross-examined. Jane's mother, Mary, was racked with guilt and suspicion, wondering if the seeds of distrust between her children had grown into something irreparably dark. Jane's siblings, particularly her brother David, found themselves at the center of a storm. Whispered accusations of jealousy, unresolved arguments about money, and long-buried resentments surfaced. David, who had often been Jane's protector but also her fiercest critic, became noticeably evasive when asked about his movements in the days preceding her disappearance. Neighbors reported hearing heated arguments late at night in the Miller household during that week, though most had long learned to keep their distance when the family's dramas spilled over. Detectives also examined digital footprints, messages exchanged between Jane and family members, a string of text arguments erupting and abruptly ending in the weeks before the crime. The discovery of deleted messages and inconsistent details and alibis only deepened the rift among those left behind, driving suspicion home. The DNA found in the incriminating underwear was eventually compared against all male members of Jane's close family. Even as the results were pending, the atmosphere in Greenbrook shifted palpably. Old wounds were reopened, family dinners, once tense, became nearly unbearable. As evidence forced the once private dysfunction of the Miller family into the hands of strangers and the court of public opinion, it became ever more difficult to separate grief from guilt. Psychological fracture and signs of criminal behavior. The weeks following the shocking forensic discoveries were a blur of mounting tension and swirling suspicion, both inside the Miller household and under the fluorescent buzz of the Greenbrook police station. People in town traded theories and whispers at the post office and during the hush before Sunday service, but Chief Adams and her investigative team focused on a growing file of hard evidence and psychological red flags that brittlely held beneath the family's otherwise stoic surface. David Miller, Jane's younger brother, soon became the center of gravity for these suspicions. Though he'd always been seen as the quiet one, a steady if withdrawn figure often described as Jane's confidant, the investigation began to chip away at that familiar mask, revealing fissures that had been spreading for years. Surveillance records flagged by Portland authorities showed David making late-night drives to and from the area of the White Church, aligned almost precisely with the estimated timeline of Jane's disappearance. Electronic toll records, receipts for gas stations along back roads, and cell phone pings quietly converged on a pattern that was difficult to dismiss as mere coincidence. But the more damning clues were those uncovered in the small, cluttered spaces of David's daily life. Forensic examiners, with a search warrant in hand, scoured his modest rental on the edge of town. There, beneath the ordinary detritus of an unremarkable life, they uncovered packets of industrial salt, identical to those found in the bag with Jane's remains, alongside a stained pair of heavy-duty gloves and an empty bottle of Mrs. Miller's favorite perfume. The drain in David's bathroom, when flushed, released a mixture blackened with organic debris. Despite his initial composure, David grew evasive under questioning, his responses turning mechanical and rehearsed whenever Jane's name came up. Friends and neighbors, once quick to defend his character, now distanced themselves after reporting a series of angry outbursts and cryptic remarks he'd made about family burdens and things that can't be fixed. A consultation with a state forensic psychologist deepened the sense that something within David had shattered long ago. Dr. Lin, the appointed specialist, noted patterns of disassociation and intense paranoia in his initial interviews, traits that hinted at a complex, untreated trauma. Yet, as more evidence piled up, it became impossible to separate David's psychological instability from the cold facts at hand: digital records, DNA links, and his increasingly erratic behavior. Many on the team wrestled with the ethical dilemma of whether David's mind had been fractured by years of family pressure or if he had used the shadow of his own trauma as a shroud to conceal deliberate choices. The sense of community in Greenbrook further eroded as accusations mounted. Local reporters circled like vultures, amplifying every leaked detail of the investigation. The school canceled spring classes for a week, and even Millie's Diner locked its doors for the first time in over 4 decades. By now, the emotional fractures first inflicted in Jane's childhood radiated outward, infecting every conversation and transforming neighborly concern into open suspicion. The Miller family's private suffering became a public autopsy, a warning and a spectacle rolled into one, as everyone, including Chief Adams herself, grappled with the realization that nothing would ever restore the old, familiar Greenbrook, no matter how the case was resolved. A chilling confession and the shocking trial. The atmosphere in Greenbrook was electric in the weeks leading up to the trial. Word that David Miller might confess had drifted through town like wildfire. The courthouse, an otherwise unassuming brick building, quickly became a fortress surrounded by police, satellite news vans, and crowds of both locals and curious strangers, hoping to catch a glimpse of someone or something that would make sense of the horror that had torn their small town apart. When the trial finally commenced, every seat in the gallery was filled. Attorneys and journalists jostled for position, scribbling notes and exchanging hushed whispers as the prosecution laid out its meticulously gathered evidence: forensic photographs, DNA matches, salt traces, digital records, and witness statements painting a damning picture. The defense, faced with an avalanche of physical proof and David's own increasingly erratic behavior during pre-trial interviews, could offer little in the way of reasonable doubt. Instead, their narrative leaned heavily on his fragile mental state, painting him as a man hounded by trauma, paranoia, and the relentless ghosts of his upbringing rather than a cold-blooded killer. But it was David's own testimony, the anticipated chilling confession, that would haunt everyone present long after the proceedings ended. Called to the stand, his appearance was disheveled, his voice hollow. He spoke in halting, disjointed sentences, recounting a night of mounting paranoia, shadowy visions, and an overwhelming conviction that some force beyond himself had guided his hand. "It wasn't me, not only me," he said, eyes darting around the crowded room. "It felt like something inside me, something dark and cold, told me that it was the only way to make the noise stop." David's narrative was at once incredible and deeply disturbing. He described vague presences, and a compulsion he could not fight, details that both terrified the townspeople and frustrated the judge and legal counsel, who pressed him for coherence. Forensic psychologists testified that while David exhibited symptoms consistent with dissociative episodes, there was no evidence of insanity or loss of awareness during the crime. Expert after expert agreed. David understood the nature and consequences of his actions, no matter how fragmented his recollections appeared in court. The trial was painful for the Miller family. Mary, Jane, and David's mother sat expressionless for most of the proceedings, hands clasped so tightly in her lap they turned white. Other siblings avoided the courthouse entirely, unable to bear the public spectacle. Greenbrook locals were split. Some whispered that David was always a troubled soul doomed to damage others, while a few clung to attributions of outside influence, unable or unwilling to accept that the evil could originate from within one of their own. As the verdict approached, tension reached a fever pitch. On the final day, the judge's voice rang out, calm, clear, and unwavering. "We find the defendant, David Miller, guilty." The sentence, life in prison with no possibility of parole, delivered with a gravitas befitting the scale of the tragedy. A ripple ran through the room, some wept, others seethed, and still others simply sat in numb silence, the finality of justice doing little to dull the pain. For years to come, people would recall the day of David's confession and the trial's dizzying revelations. Some remembered the tremor in his voice as he spoke of forces he couldn't control. Others, the stoic grief of a mother who watched one child buried and another condemned. The case would remain a cautionary tale, taught in criminal psychology classes and whispered about in Greenbrook for generations. A reminder that, sometimes the true terror lies not in the shadows, but in the shattered hearts and minds of those we think we know best. Echoes, and a bleeding lesson from an American family. Long after the courthouse doors had closed and the news cameras had faded, the aftermath of the tragedy in Greenbrook lingered like a bruise that would not fade, a constant ache in the marrow of the town, and above all, in the shell of the once close Miller family. The tragedy had fractured something central, leaving behind not only grief and shame, but an unsettling question. How could the story have been different if someone, anyone, had acted sooner, loved harder, or listened more intently? Mary Miller found herself living in the ruins of memory, her house quiet except for the small sounds of daily survival. There were still bills to pay, groceries to haul from the store, and children to coax through the motions of a life unsettled. But the axis on which their world had spun was gone. Jane's death became an absence so complete it seemed to echo through every room, while David's conviction was a silent void, another bedroom locked from the inside, another seat at the table that would never be filled. Mary had become an unintentional guardian of the past, keeping photos and keepsakes in silent tribute, talking sometimes into the darkness, her words unanswered. Her remaining children, in their own ways, bore invisible scars. Arguments now started over trivialities but always circled back to unspoken guilt or the weight of unanswerable questions. Holidays came and went with forced smiles and the ache of missing faces. Trust, once a given, now required deliberate, exhausting effort to reconstruct. In Greenbrook at large, neighbors who once waved with unguarded familiarity now looked away or gossiped in private. Strangers traced the Miller name like a cautionary tale, as if tragedy might be contagious. The wounds inflicted by the crime didn't just haunt the family, they became woven into the identity of everyone who knew them. Children at the local school walked a little quieter around the Miller siblings. Grown men hesitated before offering condolences, afraid of saying the wrong thing. For Chief Adams and other townsfolk who had once believed in the impermeability of Greenbrook's goodness, the case shattered the old illusion of small-town safety. The public restroom near the White Church, once just another mundane fixture, now stood as a monument to loss and caution. Yet, as the years dragged on, the story of the Millers slowly transformed from an open wound into a memory held in common. There were those who whispered that Jane's spirit lingered near Cedar Hill Lake, or that sometimes a cold breeze at dusk was her presence reminding the town to cherish what remains. Local teachers quietly referred troubled students to counselors, recalling how easy it had been to overlook Jane's pain. Churches and social workers tried to foster support groups or training sessions on trauma, hoping to spare future families from such a fate. For some, the morale was a warning, bitter as winter. Hurt can fester in silence. Love is not always enough to save someone lost in darkness. Others took solace in the few acts of kindness that had managed to shine through, the friends who stood by Mary, the officers who cried on duty, the neighbors who, even in their confusion, showed up to help, despite their own fears. As Mary grew older, her reflections became softer, tinged more by remembrance than regret. She started to reach out gingerly to other grieving parents, extending the only comfort she could offer, understanding. She kept a small candle in her window on the anniversary of Jane's death, a fragile promise that one broken story would not negate all hope. The Miller saga bled into Greenbrook's collective memory as a permanent lesson. Families, no matter how strong, are never indestructible. Communities break unless they are vigilant in their compassion. The haunting of the past, though sometimes relentless, also carved out space for growth, for resilience, and, if one leaned closely enough, for a gentler future. Perhaps that is the painful wisdom of tragedy, that no one can change what happened, but everyone can decide how the story is retold, and how they will protect each other and themselves going forward.